right. Yeah. Kind of a maroon looking chair. All right. I think we are live. Suan Sonna, welcome to the show. The man, the myth, the legend. How you doing?
Oh, Michael, it's great to see you.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one thing is, I really wanted to talk to you about your testimony because I've caught bits and pieces here and there, but I've never heard the whole thing. So we're kind of having a conversation here. We'll talk about some theology in a minute, but first I wanted to get to know you a little bit better. So tell me about your background. I don't think you grew up in a Christian context, or did you?
Okay, so yeah, you know, on Pints with Aquinas, I did like my 2.5 hour version of my testimony. So I'll try to like condense it down because there's so many bits and pieces. But basically, I was raised in a really good Baptist home. My father's a devout Baptist minister. My mother, she studied some theology. And so Christianity was always a part of my life. You know, studying the scriptures, loving the Lord. And I grew up around a really great Baptist community as well. So I had a lot of good like role models in the faith.
What flavor of Baptist? Just kind of Southern Baptist?
No, so I was American Baptist. And it's funny because like Southern Baptists think that we're super liberal, right? But then among the American Baptists, there's like a range of people, right? So you do have like your kind of, you know, liberal, kind of more progressive Baptists. And then you do have then people who are like more conservative. And so I kind of was in both worlds. I went, you know, to a church that was quite conservative, but then I knew my father's like theology professors and seminary professors, and some of them were on the more liberal side, right? So it was just a back and forth, but I had a good mix of both.
Yeah, so you got exposed to the good, the bad, and the ugly. Yeah. Well, you know, I as I was telling you earlier on the way over here, we're kind of in Baptist land, so I've seen it all when it comes to the Baptists. And in fact, I used to be Baptist myself. I was Southern Baptist for a little while. Then found my way into Reformed Baptist, but I never really was around any of the liberal Baptists. I'm kind of curious, what was that like?
I mean, I wasn't, let's say, disturbed or anything like that. I was just kind of like, because growing up, right, I was used to a very diverse context. So, you know, when my family first came to the U.S., I was just 18 months old and, you know, just a baby. We originally are from northeastern India, which some people might be surprised by that, but we're like a minority group in India, northeastern region. I'm from a tribe known as the Zomi tribe. We're tribal indigenous people. And basically, we ended up on the Indian side because of the British, the way they divided up the map and all that. But anyway, leaving that history lesson aside, you know, I grew up in an environment where, you know, I grew up around missionary kids, right? And so a lot of us were from different cultures, different contexts. And then I grew up around, you know, as I said before, people who were liberal and conservative. So I had the whole gamut, and it just never disturbed me, right? Like when I encountered someone who was liberal or conservative. In fact, for a time, I was liberal.
Okay, because I was about to ask, which one did you kind of lean towards?
Yeah. So I you know, growing up, the thing is, like, growing up, right, as a child, I didn't really have the concept of like left and right, liberal, conservative, right? For me, like, what I cared about was my relationship with Jesus, and I wanted to be devout and faithful. When I got into high school, I thought like, oh, you know what? You know, I'm a reasonable person, and I noticed that people on the right, you know, they tend to be crazy, or you know, conservatives tend to be crazy, whatever. And so I'm liberal, I'm more intelligent, and I wanted to still walk the line though and be a devout Christian, and I thought I could do that while still like holding to some progressive beliefs. And it was precisely in high school when that came into question.
Wow. Okay. What kind of brought it into question? Anything specific? Or?
Yeah. So, you know, going now into high school, you know, there were some things that were, let's say, in the political climate. So this was around like 2015, 2016. Obergefell v. Hodges was being decided, which is the Supreme Court decision on marriage. And, you know, a lot of Christian churches during this time, especially the Methodists, but even in my own congregation, in my own denomination, there were conversations about what is the nature of marriage? Why do we hold what we believe about marriage? And as for me as a Christian, I wanted to know, what does the Bible teach, and what would Christ hold me to? Right. And I want to be devout, and I want to hold to the truth, even if it costs me my friends, even if it costs me social standing, because at the end of the day, it's Christ.
So you were sincere. You were sincere about your faith.
Right.
Wow.
And but for me, I thought, but I can be, progressive on these issues. I thought like, there's no problem there. So I began investigating and looking in, and I noticed, okay, well, scripture seems to advocate that, marriage is a union of one man and one woman. That was really difficult for me to swallow because I'm like, I have friends, in the LGBT community. Sure. So what do I do with that? Sure. But I realized that in order to love my friends, right, as Christ loves them, I have to acknowledge the truth. But that doesn't mean that I go around mocking, insulting, and denigrating them, right? And precisely, because of my conviction in the dignity of human life. And that was another issue too, the pro-life movement. Because I also told myself, the unborn child is just a clump of cells, or things like that. And then I had a very good friend of mine from Brooklyn who called me up one day, or he texted me. And he's like, "Hey, Swan, so I heard that you're pro-choice. What's this?" And then I listened to his arguments, and I noticed, okay, he's not appealing to scripture, but his rational arguments for the pro-life position were actually very convincing. Yeah. And eventually I started looking into the same with marriage. Okay. And in particular, I began looking at the St. Thomas Aquinas, Robert George, Ryan T. Anderson, Sharif Gurgis, into the natural law tradition. And so I encountered Catholic intellectual thought for the first time, like on a really serious level when I was in high school. And it put Catholicism on the radar. Okay. But I wasn't thinking about converting, because like all the stuff about Mary, the Pope, and all that crazy stuff, right? I'm not going to believe that, I thought.
But so you were impressed by the natural law tradition in Catholicism, but not necessarily ready to look into Catholicism itself. But you're being exposed to it through presumably Catholics who are putting this forward. I don't know. I know there are some non-Catholics who put it forward, but for the natural law arguments. But it kind of seems like Catholics, we tend to be the ones who are really spearheading that.
Yeah, well, so there are, Protestant Thomists and Protestant natural law theorists, and they should be recognized. Sure. But I think like in the public sphere, when you like see debates on social issues or in the political sphere, and somebody's advocating a natural law position, it's Robert George, right? Professor McCormick Chair of Jurisprudence at Princeton, devout, wonderful Catholic man. Ryan T. Anderson, who else can we name? Other people, Alexander Proust, right? He did work in natural law theory, all that, it's generally speaking Catholics who are really using natural law arguments explicitly.
And that was appealing to you because obviously there's somebody who came and said, well, the Catholic tradition says that wouldn't necessarily sway you, but appealing to something that you can know by reason, caught your attention.
And I grew up like listening to William Lane Craig and listening to, Christian apologists like Michael Licona. Yeah. And I was very familiar with the idea of faith and reason going hand in hand. Yeah. And so when I was able to find a rational justification for Christian social and moral teaching, that opened like a whole new layer for me. And so I think it was precisely, let's say, that formation in apologetics when I was young. It prepared me for like this moment when I was wanting to find, once again, faith and reason walking hand in hand.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I have so many questions about that. I mean, Did you feel like at the time, why is this happening? Why am I questioning these things? What is God trying to show to me? Did you feel like at the time it was a little confusing, but now looking back on it, God was leading you to the church?
Well, at the time, I wasn't confused. Like, let's say I wasn't confused in terms of why is this happening to me, God? I'm kind of like, no, this is another story, right? But I had actually gone through a period of doubt as well. Okay. And I even was declared agnostic for a time. Okay. And I mean, and that's a whole like kind of bucket. But what was going on was basically issues related to natural evil and the history of evolution and all that. And so I reached out to William Lane Craig on the Reasonable Faith Q&A forum discussion board, whatever you want to call it. And Bill Craig answered my objections, and it made me kind of reevaluate things and get back into the faith. And so after that experience of kind of questioning my faith, but then coming back, I think I became comfortable with like asking questions that were uncomfortable. And I think the reason why was because like I'd already done it. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so I was like, you know what? Here I go again with another difficult topic, but this time because like I'm more familiar with how to deal with doubts, I know how to like temper my emotions and walk through this carefully without kind of jumping to rash conclusions.
That helped put your mind at ease. Yeah, shout out to Dr. Craig. He'll be on the show at the end of the month.
Oh, so, that's awesome. Yeah.
Do you mind sharing what exactly he told you that kind of put your mind at ease?
So basically, I asked this question about, I think it's under, so right now it's anonymous, although I think on Biola's website, my name's still there, but that's okay. Anyway, I asked this question and it's under like, must a Christian be a non-Darwinian? If you look up on it on the web, and I basically asked the question like, hey, if there's always been evil and suffering in the world in terms of the natural, sphere, how can we say that God's good? Like at least if you had a fall, that would be like a really nice narrative, because at one time everything was good and then it went bad, rather than it was just bad from the start, right? And so that was basically my question, and Dr. Craig used like several responses. One was that he was saying, Suan, you have a very narrow conception of what a Christian can believe. Now, some of this stuff I wouldn't believe today. So he's saying, like, you don't have to accept original sin. Well, things have changed now. But he was showing me that at least there are rational ways of like looking at the Christian faith and the Christian story. And I don't have to be confined to, let's say, the particular narrative that I had held. And so it made me open to looking at other possibilities and ways of making sense of the problem of natural evil, rather than just like the usual fall narrative. I know that might get me crucified among some people, but I think the main thing that Dr. Craig reinforced was that there are answers, and the Christian tradition has a wide range of them. And so you can go looking and see like, which one really is compelling to you. But he also pointed out like other things too, like in my arguments that were like kind of nonsensical or non sequiturs, right? And things like that. And so it kind of made me take a step back and reevaluate like my method, how I was approaching the issue. But yeah, I think that was the main thing I took away from Dr. Craig. I mean, there are things of substance, but I can't remember all of them off the top of my head. So if you want to go see what he said, you can go online.
Yeah, we'll need to go and find it, chase it down and see what all he told you.
Yeah, Watch Me Get Destroyed by William Lane Craig. That's actually the thumb.
I saw title, that, the thumbnail,
on Pints of the Coin, it's the clip of that, yeah.
That's great. So tell me, all right, so you're working through the natural law and things like that, but how does that then translate into Catholicism?
Well, so to kind of set it up a little bit, after I'd finally come back into, or after I was in the natural law tradition and I identified myself with Thomism as a Protestant, right? I noticed that a lot of my friends were like scandalized that I'd become, this devout Thomist, this devout Christian. And they were saying like, Suan, why do you believe this? Why are you doing this? And I kind of entered into a point of like a spiritual wasteland where basically in my heart, I was like, man, I feel really alone. I feel really dried out. Because, all day I was just reading and really intellectually digesting these like Thomistic arguments and Thomistic metaphysics and all that, which is good. But I didn't, let's say, have Thomas's mysticism. I didn't have any of that spiritual richness. And so eventually I stumbled across the work of a conservative philosopher named Sir Roger Scruton. And he talked about beauty. That was his big thing. And so I began looking at his view of beauty, and he has this documentary where he talks about like why beauty matters. And he mentions the Christian heritage. He mentions, well, he doesn't say Catholicism in particular, but it's like, okay, well, those are Catholic cathedrals that he's showing and Catholic statues and art and all that. And so I realized, okay, I need beauty in my life. And he talked about like how in the world before, the Enlightenment and the rise of secularism, it was enchanted. Everything had, like, in a way, every little thing had meaning. He even nudged towards the sacraments, I think. And so it just made me interested in revitalizing that enchanted view of the world. Okay. And so I began getting into cultural evangelism, and I had a preaching ministry for a while where I went to different Baptist churches and Baptist conferences, and I talked about like, how do we evangelize to young people? And so I was really concerned with this question: how do you re-enchant the world? And what got us to secularism? I go to college, and in one of my political science classes, that's precisely the topic of the class. How did we get to secularism? And the conclusion of the class was that the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, unintentionally led to secularism. And when I learned that, it just changed everything. Because for this whole time, right, I was going around to these churches. I was trying to do cultural evangelism, communicate with my friends, re-enchant the world. And I was actually part of a tradition that had unintentionally removed that.
How so? Like, how would you?
Yeah. So in particular, there's so many different ways that you can articulate it, right? So we read Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. Brad S. Gregory has a book called The Unintended Reformation. But I would say that the basic idea was, one, when you gave up a sacramental view of the world. Now, I know some Protestants, they will say we have sacraments, sure. But especially like in response to, let's say, the Catholic view of sacraments and the sacramentality of the world, there was this kind of, no, well, that's kind of superstitious. I remember Thomas Hobbes said that Aristotle's a tool for the Pope, right? So they throw out Aristotle. Some of them, not all Protestants, they were Protestant scholastics, but a lot of them on a large scale began throwing out Catholic views on the sacraments. Oh, well, it's not the real presence. The material world, isn't, let's say, it needs to have divine intervention constantly. This kind of what N.T. Wright would call an Epicurean view of the world. But basically, the material world and the supernatural world began to be separated, right? So, like, for example, because we believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, or because we believe in things like holy water and other things like that. Sacraments are these material things that communicate the power and grace of God. There isn't this conflict between nature and supernature. In sacraments, they are one and the same, just as in the incarnation, right? You have the incarnate word, you have God, right? They're the invisible, immutable God, but they're in human flesh. So basically, with that kind of loss of a sacramental worldview, it became easier to view matter, right? As pieces and, that sort of thing. I kind of atomistic view that was coming back. So that's one thing. The other thing too, and this is something that Dale Allison has talked about. He's a New Testament scholar at Princeton Theological Seminary. I watched like a bit of his course that he has online, and he talked about how, basically Protestants, when they responded to Catholic miracles, because that was one huge thing, right? Catholics were claiming that, we have miracles, Marian apparitions, saints or relics are doing things, right? And this shows us the truth of the Catholic faith. Then the Reformers came along and said, well, let's apply basically what was a proto version of the historical critical method and evaluate these miracles and see like, oh, well, no, actually, we don't have to accept that. The testimony is not reliable. Oh, these are just superstition. And then that gets picked up in the Enlightenment against all miracles. And Dale Allison talks about how the Reformers were the original skeptics. Right. I mean, there are other examples as well. Like, for example, when you have such a huge rupture away from tradition and towards like, okay, now I can use my human reason to interpret the text of Scripture. And I mean, sure, you can still use tradition, right? But you still have a sense in which it has to go through me.
Sure.
I have to see that it's acceptable and plausible, right? Then at that point, then like the individual becomes the primary unit. And then at that point, at that point, then the individual becomes primary. And then you get into eventually what I would see as like a more democratic form of, let's say, society. And then you start realizing, oh, well, we can't agree on some fundamental things, so let's agree to disagree. And then you eventually get liberal democracy from that. And so anyway, I mean, that's just a whole way of saying that there were a lot of things that came from the Protestant Reformation. Now, you might think those are good. Some are good, some are bad, right? But I realized that a lot of the things that I was hearing when I was a liberal were there in seed form in Protestantism.
Wow. And you said here the Reformers, the original skeptics. I still see that skepticism today among many Protestants, even Protestant apologists. It sounds like they use argumentation that is incredibly skeptical for the Catholic faith. When they criticize the Catholic faith. But I don't necessarily see them applying it to their own position.
Well, I mean, so once again, just to highlight Dale Allison, he's talked about in his own work on the resurrection of Jesus, how, for example, a skeptic could say, well, I looked at the evidence and it seems really interesting, the arguments for the resurrection of Jesus, but at the end of the day, I just don't know, right? I just don't know. And he analogized that to how with like appearances like Marian apparitions like Fatima or Zaytun that have like widespread documentation, widespread evidence for them, that a lot of Protestants, because it doesn't fit with their worldview, they just say, I don't know, you know, and like they just allow that to be. And Dale Allison saying, well, if I can do that with the Catholic tradition, then what would stop a skeptic from saying the same thing about the resurrection? Oh, well, I just don't know. It doesn't fit with my prior worldview. You know, so he was drawing that analogy out. And I thought, well, for me as a Catholic, I don't have to do that.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I kind of want to see what, you know, brought you to find Catholicism appealing. Was it anything in particular?
Oh, man, it was a lot of things. So basically, after I learned this in class, it made me realize that maybe I need to reevaluate my beliefs. I need to rethink what kind of Christian I am. Okay. And so after class one day, a really good friend of mine, Olivia, she invited me to Mass. Okay. And I started going to Mass and I really loved it. Because
shout out to Olivia.
Yeah. The things that we were learning in class, like about like how in the pre-modern world, before, you know, the Reformation, before the fall of Christendom, right? Mm-hmm. We were learning about like the ancient Catholic view of time, of reality. And then I was looking at the Mass and I was like, oh, I kind of see like the concepts that we were learning in class there. And so it made it so fascinating for me. And eventually,
was it Novus Ordo, I imagine?
It was Novus Ordo, right? But it was a very well done, devout Novus Ordo.
Yeah.
And basically, as time passed, I really started feeling a tug in my heart to seriously ask myself the question, is Catholicism true? Okay. And to not be afraid of whatever the answer is, right? Because I said, you know, Christ, if you want me to be Catholic, if this is the church that you built, then let me sacrifice everything for you, just as you sacrificed everything for me.
Well, what were some of the things that you were afraid of? Like, what do you feel like were the consequences?
You know, the main thing that I was afraid of was just the social repercussions of becoming Catholic. But like intellectually speaking, I wasn't, let's say, I didn't have any phobias or kind of like, oh, you know, that Mary stuff. I was just kind of like, hey, if it's true, then it's true. Sure. Right. Sure. But I was really afraid of like, you know, how my parents going to react, how my friends going to react. I had grown up in the Baptist tradition, right? And so what's going to happen once
you weren't exposed to the, you know, Rome is the whore of Babylon.
Yeah, thank the Lord I wasn't introduced to that. Yeah.
Wow.
No, because like the Protestants I grew up around, even though like, you know, some of them were, let's say, I wouldn't say anti-Catholic, but they definitely didn't have a good, positive view of Catholicism. Right. They never went that far.
Okay.
Yeah. It was always kind of like, oh, bless their heart, they're misguided, you know, that sort of thing.
That was the first thing I was exposed to by the group that really introduced me to Christianity when I was 22 years old, non-denominational, and yet they were Calvinists, even though they were non-denominational Calvinists.
Right.
But Trinitarians,
all right, there you go.
Very anti-Catholicism, and that was the first thing they showed me was a video by Dave Hunt. The woman rides the beast. The book of Revelation.
Okay.
Saying that the woman who rides the beast in the book of Revelation is Rome. So yeah, you dodged that bullet.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, I'm happy because I think, you know, when I was in college, I studied philosophy. And one of the big things in philosophy is that you study your opponent in the strongest, most charitable way possible.
Steelman.
Right. Yeah. Steelmanning, basically. And so I really wanted to know, what do Catholics believe and what's the strongest argument for it? Sure. Right. And I wouldn't like, you know, I'd press and ask questions, but I wouldn't put my foot down immediately and just say, no. Right. I wanted to know, all right, what's the strongest version? What's the strongest version, you know? And so basically as the summer went by, so now it was freshman year of college to now sophomore year, I asked Olivia again, okay, here are my objections and questions to Catholicism. And Olivia said, wow, Swan, these are great. Let me have you talk to my friend Andy. And so Andy was, you know, a son of a preacher as well, a Calvinist preacher. And, you know, Andy, he came from that tradition, but then he converted like a few years ago, I think, at that time. So this is what, like 2019, I think. And basically we had coffee, sat down, talked. I presented all my questions, and my main objections were, so the Eucharist was actually really easy for me to accept because I'm like, okay, if that's the body of the Lord, I want it.
Sure.
Right.
Of course.
So So that wasn't a huge deal for me.
Sure.
And also, you know, some people talk about, oh, well, isn't that just weird to eat human flesh? You know, and it's like, well, okay, there's a whole lot. It's not like dead human flesh, right? It's not like that.
It's under the appearances of bread and wine. So
right. And
still got accidents of bread and wine. Yeah.
Right. And the other thing too is that, you know, I just thought the idea of Christ, let's say, being there substantially, right, living, breathing, all that was just beautiful, right? And also growing up as an Asian person, people all the time said you eat weird stuff, and so I was just kind of desensitized to that objection. So that helped. Okay, so the Eucharist was really easy for me. I think the main issues were justification, Mary, and the papacy.
Okay.
So on the issue of justification, I know I heard my whole life that Catholics believed in works-based salvation.
Right.
And so I talked to Andy and I said, you know, explain to me what is the Catholic view on salvation. And he basically explained, all right, yeah, so, you know, faith begins your relationship with God, and this is unmerited. You can't earn the gift of salvation that brings you into communion with Christ because that work was accomplished on the cross. Oh, okay. So faith apart from works. All right, there you go. But then he said, but once you have that faith, right, you have to produce fruit. You have to remain faithful. You have to endure to the end. And if you commit mortal sins, and he pointed out, you know, 1 John, I think it's chapter 5, where it talks about the degrees of sin, mortal versus venial sins. I was like, you know, that makes a lot of sense. And the funny thing was, I actually already believed that. Wow. Even as a Protestant, because I was never in the Calvinist tradition, and there were Protestant theologians like Jerry Walls who helped steer me away from that because I watched his videos. And so I was always kind of like maybe leaning on Arminianism or something like that. But basically, I always had a sense that you need to be faithful to Christ. Yeah. You need to step up. And you can't back away. You can't chicken out. And, you know, passages like in Luke's gospel where Jesus says, if you hesitate at the plow, then you're unworthy of the kingdom of heaven. I was like, okay. Yeah. So I think very clearly, right, Jesus is saying there, if you give up, if you back away, if you, you know, fall into sin and you just live this life of debauchery, that cuts you off from me. And I mean, you know, especially in John's gospel, the theme of obedience, 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 John 14:15, if you love me, then you'll do as I command. I realized, okay, yeah, I've always held this belief that you need to remain faithful. And one way that you do is through your actions, right? Now, I do want to say something really quick on justification. Sure. Yeah. You know, some people say, but Suan, that's like so much effort. You're working to be saved to make it to the end, right? And I'd actually say no. Because once you are in Christ, once you have been saved, once you have been redeemed, right, you're justified and sanctified all at once. You're declared righteous because you have been transformed and infused with Christ's righteousness, right? When you live a life of good works, when you live a life that manifests fruit, right, that's not you trying to earn salvation. That's not you trying to, you know, use vain effort. When you live a righteous life, that's actually you surrendering and becoming passive towards receiving the glory and beauty and grace of Christ, of God. So it's not vain effort. When you actually manifest good works as a Christian, that is you surrendering to Christ, right? But it's an active surrender, if you will. But anyway, I just noticed that at some point, a lot of the Protestant objections were misguided, right? So like the idea that the works before justification and the works after justification aren't different, right? So, you know, the works before justification, those are fruitless. Those aren't going to do anything for you, right? Because your works can't get you justification. It's the work of Christ that gets you justification. But then once you are justified and declared righteous, that has an expectation on you then to manifest the gift. And I mean, there's so many different examples of this. There's a great book by, I think it's William Barclay, if I'm not mistaken, or John Barclay. It's one of those two. I know it's Barclay, but he has a book called Paul and the Gift of Grace, or the Power of Grace, Paul and the Power of Grace. And he talks about how basically in the ancient world, we have this idea in the Western world that like when you give a gift, right? Like I give you a gift, Michael, we have this idea that if it's a real genuine gift, there are no strings attached. Yeah. But in the ancient world, that's not how that worked. In the ancient world, when you give a gift, it also placed an expectation on the other person to like reciprocate that, to honor it, right? And then similarly, with the story of the unforgiving servant in Matthew's gospel, right? You have this person who was forgiven, who was legally free of the bond, but then because he didn't forgive his brother, he was placed back into slavery, you know, back into the bond that he owed to the master. And so I was like, I mean, and then, you know, obviously you can't forget James, where he says man's not justified by faith alone, but by works. And it's like, well, how do you square that? Right. And so anyway, long story short, justification, that was a no-brainer for me. Yeah, the Catholics got it right. All right. So moving on, Mary, right? That was another big issue because, you know, for me, I was very, very, very devout about Christ at the center. Christ first and foremost, solus Christus. And so having Mary and the saints, I kind of thought that just distracts from the Christ who is at the center of the story. And then I realized, wait a minute, no, actually, when you enter into this relationship with Christ, he wants you to also have a relationship with his mother. Now, it's not the same kind of relationship you have with Christ, right? Because Christ is the one who is the author and finisher of the faith. He saves you, right? He is God, okay? Mary, as much as I love her, she's not God. Yeah, right. But I realized that it's kind of like, let's say that you're engaged and you want to get to know your bride's family or the bridegroom's family, right? I mean, why wouldn't you want to know the bridegroom's mother? Why wouldn't you want to know the bridegroom's, you know, brothers and best friends, the saints, right? The disciples. And I realized that the whole vision of Catholicism, the whole view of the gospel in Catholicism, you know, it's not this individualistic kind of, okay, now I have a personal relationship with Jesus. It's there, right? You do have a personal relationship with Jesus. But it's not like, you know, through the resurrection of the death and resurrection of Jesus, you know, you've been reconciled to God, you have eternal life, and you have this personal relationship. Right. It's not just that, like that is definitely at the core, but it's that through Christ's death and resurrection, he has built a new covenant kingdom in people. Right. So it's really like the death and resurrection of Christ was to build the church, was to build this new covenant redeemed people. And so at the core of then the gospel is the church, is this idea of creating this redeemed people and family that I am born into, right? I'm, you know, because I'm born of my human mother. I was born in sin, but then through the waters of baptism, regenerated, and then I enter into, and I'm born again into the new covenant family. And so at the core of Catholicism is the idea of family. And not to kind of play on Vin Diesel, right? But family is key. It's at the heart of the faith. And so that's what makes sense then of the saints and of Mary. All right. So, you know, that kind of helped move the ball forward. And then there were other things too, like typological arguments for the Blessed Mother, like the Ark of the New Covenant. That really got me.
That was big for me as well.
Yeah,
especially with the Marian doctrines.
Yeah. I think it helped show that, you know, obviously as a Protestant, I respected Mary. And I thought that, you know, because I think some Protestants, they would react to Catholics and say, well, yeah, like we also love the Blessed Mother, you know, but although there are some Protestants who really will say some things where it raises your eyebrow and you're like, you know, I don't know if you want to say that about Christ's mother, but anyway, but there are some Protestants who really like try to have a kind of Marian devotion that is compatible within their tradition. But when I realize these Marian typologies that are actually genuinely there in scripture, right? Not like read in typologies, but biblical typologies, right? That are in the text itself, like in Luke's gospel.
I was thinking that too.
I realized that, okay, the early church, and especially the gospel of Luke, the gospel writers, they must have had a much higher view of Mary than I'm giving them credit for. And so I started looking into that. And that's a whole long story too. But basically I realized, okay, I think I can accept the Marian dogmas. Those seem to make sense to me. All right. And then the very last thing was the papacy. And I realized, oh, this is the issue, right? Because if the papacy is true, everything else follows.
That's true. All
right. Because it's, you know, the fundamental issue for me as a Protestant, I realized, was the issue of authority. And if Christ really did institute this Petrine successional office to unify and protect the church, then who am I to break away from that principle of unity? And so this is where I did research into the New Eliakim argument. I realized that there was a consensus among even Protestant scholars that accept the allusion between Isaiah and Matthew. And that just opened a whole new world for me. And I began looking into the arguments and developing them further. And I began looking at even Protestant objections and then seeing like, okay, how would a Catholic who is really informed respond? And then eventually I realized, oh, I'm Catholic.
We're very similar because for me, what sold me on the papacy was the connection between Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16. Especially Scott Hahn in the work that he did there.
Right.
Obviously, you had not come around yet to give us your developed version of it. But what was out there with Scott Hahn was enough to really show me that there's certainly a connection here.
Right. I mean, the textual illusion is acknowledged among scholars, although there are notable scholars who are either uncertain or deny it. So just to mention a few, there are people like G.K. Beale who kind of remain agnostic. And then John Noland, I read his commentary on Matthew, and it's a really good commentary. And I think he raises some really interesting questions. Hopefully one day I can like write a paper responding to some of his objections. But, there are some voices though. So I'm not going to say like it's a unanimity. And then, somebody's going to say, hey, Suan, wait, hold on. There's a scholar here. It's like, okay, I acknowledge that. Right. But the broad consensus, even when you read certain commentaries that are published now, it's just taken for granted. Yeah, the illusion's there. But even like the consensus on Matthew 16:18, that it's Peter who's the rock of the church, right? Like that also just blew my mind, because I thought as a Protestant, oh, well, that's an issue that hasn't been settled by the scholars. And then I read people like D.A. Carson, Oscar Kuhlman, and others who are just saying, guys, we got to stop saying that the Catholics are wrong on this. They have it.
A fair amount of Protestants will admit that, but then they'll challenge whether or not there's succession.
Yeah, right.
But that's where Isaiah 22 comes in. Help with the question of succession.
Yeah,
that's what really got me through that. Again, Isaiah 22. So you ended up finding yourself into the Catholic Church what year?
So I think I made the decision in 2019 during my sophomore year, and then I went through the RSA program, and then we entered.
It says Mike has no mic.
Oh, is there a problem?
Let me unplug and replug.
Is it my mic too?
Go ahead and test it and see if yours is working.
Okay, 1 2 3 1 2 3.
What about mine? Testing 1 2 3. Testing. You can hear me?
Okay.
Well, y'all. Let's see. There we go. All good in the chat. Okay,
all good.
Both are
there we
working.
go.
I don't know. I just had to unplug the XLR cable and plug it back in. But you were saying you off again. I didn't do anything. Testing 1 2 3. Check the cables behind the soundboard. Make sure they're connected. Out again. That's weird.
Man.
Testing. No. You can hear Swan. So it's just me then. Testing 1 2 3.
Okay.
Somebody asked, is Swan made of cardboard? I can verify Swan is not made of cardboard. So, but the question is, am I made of plastic? Cardboard? The question still though is, am I made of cardboard?
I mean, I haven't confirmed it yet. So, to the audience, we haven't been able to confirm just yet. So I need to pour like some water on Michael, see if he melts, that sort of thing.
But you can confirm that some of the studio is made of cardboard.
Oh yeah, right? Definitely. Like, not joking. Some of the studio is made of cardboard. That's all I'm going to say. No further context.
Yeah, maybe about 1% of the studio is made of cardboard. All right, so it looks like we're getting good sound in the chat, but y'all let me know if we end up getting any further issues with it. All right, so I believe you were saying that in 2019 you started really discerning Catholicism.
Yeah. So yeah, 2019 I made the decision like near the end, going into like winter break, I believe. And basically, just to kind of explain that moment, Andy and I, we were in a bookstore together, and it just hit me all of a sudden that as a Christian, I hadn't been home for most of my life. That Christ had built this home for us on the earth, the church, connected to heaven, and I was outside of it. And that just really impacted me, and it made me stop and almost like weep. Like, what did we lose? Why did we split? Why did this ever happen? And at that moment, I was like, yeah, I'm ready to become Catholic, And I remember Andy told me God's not going to waste the time where you were Protestant. And I think that's been very true. And so my heart was on fire for the Lord. I kept on contacting Protestant theologians, though, and asking my questions because I wanted to make sure, am I making the right decision? Because this is a serious question.
Oh, of course.
But then over time, I just kept on finding, okay, that's a straw man. Okay, no, I can see how a Catholic can reasonably respond to that, right? And so I just realized that a lot of the like Protestant apologetics against Catholicism weren't that good. But still, I tried to give Protestantism the benefit of the doubt as well and read like what the best of them at the time had to say, right? And so still, I just wasn't convinced.
I had a similar experience. I was messaging professors and RTS theologians and professors and church historians, and the responses I was getting from them was just really poor, and I thought, that's concerning.
Yeah, right. But anyway, winter break goes by, and then all of a sudden COVID happens. And so I was supposed to be confirmed on Easter Vigil 2020, but then that had to be canceled and moved, and then eventually though I was confirmed Pentecost 2020. So it would be this month 3 years ago that I was confirmed. And I actually found the other day on my phone the video of when I first received communion, and it was just incredible to watch that.
Wow.
I remember like when I finally was able to receive the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, inside of me, I felt like I was just like this raging ocean, longing for Christ, longing for his body, his blood, his soul, his divinity. And then once I consumed the Eucharist, I could consciously feel that like that raging sea had become a stream, and I was content and satisfied. And I remember too, when I bit down on the Eucharist for the first time, and I heard this crunch, in my mind, what immediately popped up was Christ being broken on the cross. And I was like, wow, okay, that really hit me in my core. But yeah, I mean, so what I want to say here, at least just to kind of wrap up the story of my testimony, is that, I don't think that Protestants aren't Christians. They're my brothers and sisters. I love them. They showed me Christ, and some of the heroes of the faith for me are Protestants. And if I can talk about maybe a little bit on the intercession of saints, and then we can maybe segue into that topic. When I was, younger, I grew up in the Baptist church, and I had people in the congregation who were like my grandparents, because my biological grandparents were in India, and I grew up in the US, and I didn't really have anybody in that role until these people stepped in. And in particular, I had someone named Grandpa David. Okay. Right. Grandpa David loved Coca-Cola. He loved Elvis. He was a fan of The Flash. He loved comic books. He showed me Batman, and Batman's my favorite superhero now. Like, so he had a huge impact on my life, and he was such a good man. Like, he genuinely loved the Lord. And I remember, like, when I was struggling through the issues with marriage, right, and what is, the nature of marriage, my adopted grandmother, she told me a story about how, Grandpa David, he had a friend who was gay, and he would tell him, I love you because you have the image of God, because Christ loves you, and I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. And this person, was homeless for a bit, and he gave him a place to stay. And he said, I believe what the Bible teaches on marriage, but that isn't incompatible with me loving you. Right. And so to see my adopted grandfather, because at this point he had died, to see his example still influencing me, that really spoke volumes. And even sometimes after school, I would visit, the cemetery and just read the Bible with him. I'd visit his tomb, and I would read 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the creed on the resurrection, because, my adopted grandfather, when he died, he asked to be, before he died, he asked to be buried facing east, so that when Christ returns, he can beat everyone to Jesus and have him to himself. And so I grew up, as a child of the resurrection, very much waiting and anticipating because of my grandfather's example. And I remember there was this day where, like, I'd read 1 Corinthians with him, and I just asked Grandpa, like, hey, Grandpa, tell Jesus I said hi. Grandpa, tell Jesus that I love him. Grandpa, I love you. And I believed because he was alive in heaven, he could hear me, and he could bring those prayers to Jesus. And I didn't know this at the time, that was basically within my, human nature, within my humanity, the desire for the intercession of saints. Sometimes like Catholic ideas like icon veneration and intercession of saints, when you view them in a theological context, they seem like very like foreign and weird and like particular. But then when you think about like no, like as human beings, especially like things like intercession of the saints, we do that, already with our deceased loved ones. We talk to them. We don't, I mean, some Protestants might believe that we really can't communicate with them, that there's a veil between us, or like there's a, somehow like, heaven's closed off from us and we can't communicate. But no, I think that, for me, I had been introduced basically to through my own life, a proto version of intercession of the saints through my adopted grandfather.
Wow. So you just kind of innately already accepted the intercession of the saints.
Right. And yeah, I mean, that's what really hit me, realizing that so much of Catholicism is so natural with with our humanity. It just fits. It just makes sense. And so like things like a magisterium, given our social, rational, political nature, makes so much sense. Intercession of saints, icon veneration, these things also make sense with human nature.
No, I want to talk to you more about the intercession of the saints, because I think you recently gave a presentation on intercession of the saints in Judaism. So effectively, I guess in the Old Covenant.
Right. So this is a topic that I've been very interested in for a long time, so like, obviously, that I've done a lot of work in the papacy, but I wanted to finally do work actually on intercession of the saints, because I think this is an area that is a stumbling block for a lot of Protestants. And it needs more attention.
Sure.
Right. And so what I began to do is look into Second Temple Jewish sources. So I've learned over time that, okay, you need to be very cautious when you use rabbinic sources to try. When you use rabbinic sources, you need to take into account, what's the date of the source?
Right.
Can you actually trace that tradition back to the 1st century?
Right.
To what extent is that later rabbinic legends or stories? Right. So anyway, I've learned my lesson there.
Yep.
But anyway, I began to look at Second Temple Jewish sources. And what I found was that there is a concept of, for example, bringing your prayers to angels, and the angels bring the prayers to God. So like Enoch, for example, First Enoch is a great example. And the presentation you're referring to was on Dustin Quick's channel, Holy Smokes. So if you want to watch it, I present like a lot of the evidence there. But also I began reading like Second Maccabees. And there's a commentary, I think, by Jonathan Goldstein, if I'm not mistaken, in the Anchor Bible, Anchor Yale series. And in, I think it's chapter 15, Judas Maccabees, he has this vision before they go into battle against Nicanor of Onias, the high priest, who has been deceased, and the prophet Jeremiah, who's deceased but alive in heaven, appearing. He has this vision of them appearing before him, and Jeremiah says, I have been praying for Israel and protecting it. And so it's like, wait a minute.
Wow.
Okay, so they're alive and conscious in heaven. They're doing things, right? And that to me was very compelling. And what I looked into when I looked into Goldstein's commentary, he said, okay, well, maybe the vision's vertical, maybe it's not vertical, meaning real or not. Maybe it's like is there something actually in reality that vision corresponds to or not? But some Jewish traditions hold that, for example, the sword that I think it's Onias or Jeremiah gives to Maccabees was a real sword. So it's like, wait, it's a vision, but a real sword. So vision doesn't just mean fake or like imaginary, right? Especially like prophetic visions. Where like, Isaiah maybe is transferred up to heaven, or Paul has a vision of whatever. Like visions in the biblical world weren't these imaginary things. They actually had a layer of reality to them. But anyway, Goldstein talks about how, okay, but if you're looking for like more direct evidence for the intercession of saints, he says the belief is found. Philo of Alexandria, right, who is also writing into the late end of the leading into the 1st century, right, and then also Josephus. So in Philo of Alexandria, he has a book called like Rewards and Punishments, and he talks about how for those who are righteous, they'll be praying like basically for their children and interceding for them. And I'm like, oh, okay, Philo of Alexandria, this Jewish writer, he's talking about this belief of intercession of the dead. And then also Josephus talks about how the Jews at the time, now you have to be careful because, the Jews were very diverse in the Second Temple period, right? Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, whatever. But anyway, Josephus talks about how the Jews, they believed that Abraham gave the speech when he was getting ready to sacrifice Isaac. I think this is in Antiquities. Yeah, it's in Antiquities. And Josephus basically says, Abraham says, my son, somehow the Lord has willed that you won't see me until old age, or you won't, be with me in person, in human form, right? In person. You're going to die now instead of other cause of death. And he says, but my son, when you're in heaven, please remain comforting to me. Please basically still remain faithful to me, still be there for me in heaven. And so it's like, okay, so Abraham seems to be alluding to this idea that Isaac is still going to be able to be with him in a way, despite the fact that he's going to be on the other side of paradise. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so that shows that they may be interceding, but is there any evidence that the person here on earth is asking for their intercession?
Yeah, I mean, so I think Philo and please check this, but I think Philo is talking about like the people, the sons and daughters will be helped, and their prayers, I think, will be received, or maybe it's like or something like that. But even there, like in the example of Abraham, right? Like Abraham in the Josephus story, he's kind of anticipating asking Isaac for help, right? But then I think Enoch is the very explicit example where you have people bringing their prayers up to the angels and the angels bring it to God. Now, somebody might say, but Suan, Enoch's not scripture. And it's like, sure, right? It's not scripture, except, but the other books like Maccabees, that's scripture. But I think what Enoch shows and what these other texts show is that in the culture, in the milieu, right, that was there, in the religious milieu, the cult that was there was definitely a belief, right, that the people in heaven are alive and that they can hear prayers and that they can do certain things from heaven, right? And then if you think about, all right, so that was there in like late Second Temple Judaism, then you get into the apostolic age, and then you get into the early church. Mm-hmm. So you see here, right, belief intercession of saints. Okay, now we don't know maybe if the apostles taught this, but we see that it continued. Mm-hmm. Well, then you can connect the dots,
sure,
right? And then you get to, well, if the church continued to have this belief in the intercession of saints, it must have been handed on from the Judaism of the apostles. And so I argue that it's like historically plausible that the apostles presupposed or taught the church intercession of saints. They wouldn't have viewed it as idolatry. They wouldn't have viewed it as paganism. They would have understood the distinction between veneration and worship.
Yeah.
And I mean, and it's well documented too. So William Horbury, who is a former professor at Cambridge, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's Cambridge. He has a paper called The Cult of Christ and the Cult of the Saints. And he argues that the cult of saints, it has some connections to like Gentile Christianity, but it has a firm foot in ancient Second Temple Judaism. That you had Jews celebrating festivals, venerating the tombs of saints. Mm-hmm. And this is recorded in Matthew's gospel. So you have, for example, Jesus, when he's criticizing the Pharisees, he talks about how they build monuments and they decorate the tombs. We're going to talk about that tomorrow on my presentation on icon veneration, right? But, there was an active cult of venerating saints and their tombs. So anyway, to make the long story short, that's some of the evidence, right, for this belief in the Second Temple period.
That's interesting. Also, what you said earlier about angels taking the prayers of the saints to God, because it reminds me of the book of Revelation. I think it's chapter 8, where you see an angel doing just that, taking the prayers of the saints and presenting it to God. And so I think that we can see there, it seems to carry the idea of the intercession of the saints right there in the Apocalypse.
Right.
Yeah. So that for me was very helpful in moving the ball forward when I was struggling with it.
I should say, though, that when you asked for like evidence of like actually, people crying out to the saints,
yes,
in Sirach, I think it's chapter 4, if I'm not mistaken, and Dustin Quick, he pointed this out to me, so credit to him. Dustin pointed out that there's this passage where basically the author of Sirach is praising Elijah, talking about the glories of Elijah, just all the things he's done, basically venerating Elijah. Yeah. And the important thing to remember is that obviously Jews believed during this time that Elijah was alive because he had been taken up to heaven. And so this would be an instance of venerating and communicating with somebody who was alive in heaven. And that was a text from the Second Temple period.
That's interesting. I haven't considered that.
Yeah. And, other people have mentioned in Matthew's gospel, right, the transfiguration, when Jesus is said to be talking to Moses and Elijah. Okay, that seems kind of Catholic, Orthodox, those sorts of things. Or even in Acts, and this is just kind of an aside, but in the book of Acts, when I think it's Peter or somebody mentions the tomb of David, right? That shows you that's an allusion to the cult of the saints during the Second Temple Judaism, because they had these holy sites where they believed that they had the tombs of the patriarchs and they would go venerate them. Wow. And even into the 2nd century, I think Cassius Dio, he has a history, like a history of the Jews, or of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Yeah. And he mentions Cassius Dio in that history, that the Jews up to that time had venerated the tomb of Solomon. He explicitly says that the tomb of Solomon was a site of veneration. Yeah. So it's there.
It's a good point that you made earlier too, about how if you see it prior to the apostolic period, and then you also see it continuing after, right, it's pretty reasonable to say that the apostles would have endorsed this.
Yeah, the bridge is there, right? The bridge is the apostles.
Yeah, especially like I said, in light of some things that we do find in the proto-canonicals and also deuterocanonicals. I could certainly see that. It's fascinating.
And I want to emphasize too, just like a lot of things here, because in terms of like historical methodology, one thing that even like good Protestant New Testament scholars will emphasize is that you can't read in Protestantism into the ancient Jewish context or the 1st century context, right? And so some Protestants might say, no, Paul, he wouldn't believe in the intercession of the saints. That's pagan. And it's like, well, let's take Paul in his historical context, and using, a historical method, you can see, okay, it's very likely that a 1st century Palestinian Jew who was entrenched within that environment of the cult of the saints, and even it's alluded to in the Gospels, right? The tombs of the patriarchs, the tombs of the saints, the resurrection narrative in Matthew with the after the resurrection of Jesus, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the tombs, right, come open after the resurrection of Jesus, and you see the saints enter into the holy city and appear to people, right? That's also an allusion to an awareness of the cult of the saints and the holy sites of their tombs, right? And so I'm just saying there that if we're going to be using the historical method, what very likely did the apostles hand on as tradition? I think it's that. I mean, I'm confident in that conclusion.
For somebody who would say, as you indicated there, well, Paul wouldn't have believed this. Right. What immediately comes to my mind is, if the New Testament did not record that Paul had Timothy circumcised, nobody would have believed that he would have had him circumcised in light of the things that he said. No, I don't believe that there's a contradiction here.
Sure.
I don't believe that he contradicted himself or was a hypocrite. But what I'm saying is, he obviously said some very strong things against a certain understanding of circumcision.
Yeah.
That may lend itself to the impression that he would have never allowed Timothy to be circumcised. So again, unless it had been recorded, I think a lot of people would be like, he never would have allowed for that. And yet he did.
And one thing to watch out for, especially when, we have these Protestant Catholic dialogues, is sola scriptura versus solo scriptura, right? So sola scriptura, the belief that scripture is the only infallible source, or where really it should be inerrant source, because I gave that presentation on your channel where I made a distinction between inerrant versus infallible. That's an important distinction. But so you can agree, and even when I was a Protestant investigating Catholicism, I was still operating implicitly with sola scriptura, and I was just saying, like, okay, but even if it's not recorded in the New Testament explicitly, if there are good historical reasons for including, let's say, archaeological, historical, theological facts surrounding the culture that helps inform how I interpret the text of scripture, then that's good. But some people might say, oh, no, you can't do that. When it starts rubbing against their theology, they're going to become solo scriptura. No, it's got to be in the Bible, okay? Once you start bringing in that Second Temple Jewish stuff, no. And I'm just like, that's inconsistent.
Yeah,
that's inconsistent.
They'll change their methodology really quick.
Yeah. I mean, to give you like one concrete example, like on the debate on Peter and Eliakim, that argument that I raised on the textual allusion and what you can draw from it, for the longest time, I thought that Isaiah 22:25, where it talks about how the peg representing the house, I thought representing Eliakim would be undone.
Yeah.
I thought that meant, so the office ended with Eliakim, the office of chief steward. Some scholars will call it prime minister. That's somewhat anachronistic, but because many scholars call it that, I think it's just to help like illustrate in our minds like what this office was like. But let's just call it chief steward for the sake of, not being accused of being anachronistic. I thought the office of chief steward ended with Eliakim, and so I interpreted the peg, just using my Bible, right? I interpreted that peg as Eliakim being undone. And then I had a friend, Daniel Vecchio, who looked into the archaeological record. And what he found was that after Eliakim, there were successors to his office as chief steward over, the kingdom of Israel, or Judah, technically. And when I realized that, I saw, okay, I need to reinterpret, because of these archaeological facts, these extra biblical realities.
Right.
I have to reinterpret the text of scripture, or rather interpret it properly, because scripture is not going to contradict the facts of history, right? Because it's the inerrant word of God. And so scripture was saying basically that when the peg was being undone, I think it was the house of Eliakim that was being undone,
rather than the office.
Right. Because when the Babylonians came in, right, and conquered Jerusalem and, destroyed the temple, the office of Eliakim, the office of chief steward, ended, but it was converted into a different kind of office. So eventually it becomes like under foreign occupation, it becomes a governor kind of office. Because like if you have somebody who was formerly a chief steward, he knows how to do public administration, you don't want to find another guy. But because you are now the head honcho, and not the king, what you can do then is just say, okay, chief steward, you become a governor now of Judah. And that's what basically happens with the office. And then it kind of fizzles out from there.
But you didn't realize this until you went to an extra biblical source, to then properly interpret scripture.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So going off of just the text of scripture alone, I was misinterpreting scripture.
Yeah.
But when I looked at extra biblical sources, that helped me interpret scripture properly.
Yeah.
And so that was actually, not to go back to my conversion story, but that's what also things like that helped me realize that, tradition really does have a valid place in helping us interpret the word of scripture.
This is very much related to the problem that we find in Protestantism with sola scriptura and eschatology, specifically the book of Revelation. When a person divorces reading the book of Revelation from its history, they end up with all kinds of wacky interpretations. And so your point about I need to interpret scripture through this history, that's important. And I can see it applying elsewhere to these eschatological points of view, like the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
We're going to take a short break here, about a 5-minute break. We're going to grab us some coffee and we are going to return. Y'all hang tight. And we are going to continue after that with a conversation about the papacy and more about Eliakim. And we'll have a little bit more after that. And finally, we'll conclude with some live Q&A from y'all. So y'all hang tight. Again, we'll be back in about 5 minutes. So stay tuned. Hey everybody, just wanted to tell you about my new free ebook, Church Chaos, Biblical Insights for Confused Catholics. If you are a confused Catholic and you're thinking about leaving the Catholic Church, or you're thinking about converting to the church, but you see that there's a crisis in the church and you're just unsure, this is the book for you. Again, it is free. Just simply go to reasonandtheology.com. You'll see a pop-up that comes up on your screen. Just simply click on it and you'll put in your email and it will provide you the free PDF ebook right then and there. Please check it out if you're confused about the situation in the Catholic Church today. reasonandtheology.com. Random $100 bill there. Oh, we will can't see it, so we're gonna put that right there.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
And
we're not going to talk about it. So let's resume here. Let's talk about the papacy and Eliakim. This is a lot of, you've done a lot of work in this particular area.
Yeah.
I think you did your undergrad thesis on it.
No, so that's kind of I'm honored that you would say that, because what I did was it's something like a thesis, right? Okay. But I didn't do it for my undergrad. My undergrad was in philosophy, and I studied primarily ethics and metaphysics, which was great, but I realized that over time I'm more interested in biblical studies. And so during the summer before I entered the Dominicans, and we can talk about the Dominicans if you want, I'm totally open about that. I recorded this 4-hour lecture. It was like 116 something slides, I think.
I remember that.
Of my argument for the papacy from the Peter, Eliakim, Matthew 16:19, Isaiah 22:22, textual allusion, typology, whatever you want to call it. And that was my argument.
So this is just personal research you've done. It wasn't for your school?
Nope. Personal devotion to just really loving to study.
Wow. Yeah. Which we severely needed. So I appreciate that you did it. So tell us a little bit about it and how it really impacts the question about the papacy.
Right. So the argument is that beginning first with the textual allusion between Isaiah and Matthew, where basically Matthew 16:19, right, the famous Caesarea Philippi confession, Peter receives the keys of the kingdom from Christ, and Jesus says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Mm-hmm. Whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. Many scholars see a textual allusion to Isaiah 22:22, wherein under King Hezekiah's administration, there's this corrupt chief steward named Shebna who is replaced by God through the word of Isaiah with a good chief steward, Eliakim. And it says there in Isaiah 22:22, I will give you the key of the house of David. Whatever you open, none shall shut. Whatever you shut, none shall open. Or I'll place on your shoulder the key of the house of David, something like that. But the basic idea is there that this person is receiving a key of a particular house, and they can have contrastive powers, right, of opening and shutting. Just as in Matthew, Peter can bind and loose, and he receives the key of keys of a particular kingdom. And so I, in the video, go into the reasons why I think there's a textual allusion there. And I've listened to some objections recently to the argument in terms of the textual allusion. And from what I can tell, I think I can sustain the textual allusion against all these recent objections still.
What would you say to those who say, well, the Septuagint version, the Greek version, or Greek translation of the Old Testament Hebrew, seems to be weaker when it comes to the allusion? What would you say about that?
Right. So this is a wonderful question, because it gets into the manuscript tradition of the Septuagint, right? So I can't name them in particular. I know that it's I think it's Alexandrinus and Vaticanus, if I'm not mistaken, these two particular Septuagint versions. And basically the original text, and I'm basing this off of Moises Silva's work, a New Testament scholar, on the Septuagint, where basically the original text of the Septuagint probably just said, I will give you the glory of the house of David, something like that. And the key isn't mentioned, right? And so that's kind of, a key thing that needs to be there for the allusion to be sustained. Now, one possibility is that when Jesus originally uttered this phrase, or a phrase like it, right? Jesus, scholars generally will hold that Jesus spoke Aramaic or Hebrew. Now, in the Hebrew Aramaic, you can very clearly see the key of the house of David is mentioned. Okay. And so, for example, in the Targums, which is the Aramaic kind of versions of the Hebrew Bible, you have it mentioned the key of the sanctuary. So during the Jewish kind of thought of the time, Eliakim was eventually received as a high priest. They thought Eliakim was this high priest figure. And there's some warrant to at least the idea that he was priestly.
Yeah, Dr. Barber wrote a paper on that not long ago, showing a priestly connection with Eliakim.
Yes. And I cited that paper in my research on the 4-hour lecture.
Yeah, I saw part of it. I haven't been able to see the whole thing. Yeah. That's incredible, by the way, that you did that lecture for 4 hours. You beat my record.
What's your record?
Because my record is a stream that was about 3 hours, 45 minutes or so.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
You got me beat
Well,
on
we'll
that
see if
one.
I can beat my own record tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
with
Yeah.
the icon presentation.
So how many slides was it? 116? And this new one is about...
I think it was 116.
And the one for tomorrow is
134.
Yeah,
I think
we're gonna beat the records.
We'll see.
But I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
So okay, well, why do you think then that the key reference is missing from the Septuagint?
Right. So one thing to keep in mind, and this isn't controversial, is that the Septuagint is itself an interpretation and translation of the Hebrew Bible. Right. That is to say that it wasn't always trying to go word for word what the Hebrew text was saying to the Greek equivalent. What it was trying to do was it was also trying to, sometimes like when you translate a text, right? Like, for example, there are some phrases that if you translated literally the Greek from the New Testament into English, it would sound really clunky or it wouldn't make sense. And sometimes you might have to take some artistic liberties to express, what was really going on, right? So, so with the Septuagint version of Isaiah, I think that's what's going on here. They're kind of doing an interpretation and translation simultaneously, and that's what's going on.
Is that why in some instances Septuagint seems to differ significantly from the Masoretic text?
Right. And then, this is something that New Testament scholars do all the time. They try to figure out when the New Testament alludes to a passage, were they using the Masoretic text, although technically the Masoretic text is a much later text, but just basically the Hebrew Bible or the Greek translation that is the Septuagint. They try to figure out, which text did the writer have in front of them.
So I mentioned earlier that one of the things that kind of sold me on the idea that the picturing office and primacy is something that endures after the apostles. Is something that we kind of see in the book of Isaiah. His office, as you mentioned, has successors.
Right.
And therefore, if this is being not necessarily referenced, but alluded to in the New Testament, then one could surmise that perhaps the office would also endure. That is the office that Jesus is instituting there in Matthew 16.
Yeah.
Plus the need is certainly there after the time of the apostles. We still need that picturing ministry, so it makes sense. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Maybe
succession.
Yeah.
Right. So I want to be careful here because the typology itself, I think the primary theme and thrust of what's going on in the typology, the connection that Matthew, or Jesus rather in Matthew, is making is an allusion to Eliakim's authority.
Okay.
That's the impetus. That's the connection. That's the theme that unites the two passages together. Because you have this bestowal of Peter, this glorified servant, as Eliakim in the Old Testament is this glorified servant. And so when you're trying to make sense of the textual allusion, you want to look at what is really, like, what's the essence? What's the thing that unites them together? And I've cited a work called Interpreting the Bible. I forget the author's name. It's an unusual name from what I recall, so that's why it's difficult. But if you go to like my updated presentation, the argument, I mentioned the scholar, and they basically said, look for the basic element, the thing that basically unites them together. And so it really is this emphasis on authority, right? Now, I think from that typology, though, you could make arguments for succession. And I've even said in my 4-hour lecture that it at least has succession and potency, lurking in the background, because as you pointed out, right, this bestowal of the keys to Eliakim, it wasn't a one and done deal. It was part of a successional office that continued to be successional, right? That would be a way that you could try to build up the argument for succession. You could also mention other things like Joshua Sijuwadi, great scholar. He's a philosopher and theologian. He's talked about how there are a priori arguments for the papacy. So just simply why a papacy in the first place would make sense. And then you could say, then it would make sense that you would have succession. And just as the office in the, let's say, Old Testament was so important that it continued to have successors, right? The role of the chief steward in the Old Testament, among other things, was to manage the royal estate, manage the king's properties and palaces and that sort of thing. He was also responsible for some temple duties based on the clothing that he wore. That's a very likely conclusion. Also, because the king in Old Testament Israel was the head of the temple, right? Because it was technically, it was God's house built by the king and managed by the king. some people have this idea that it was the high priest who was the head honcho. No, the king in the Old Testament was a religious figure and, let's say, a political government figure, right? There wasn't this distinction between church and state, right? I mean, in one sense, Israel was quite literally God's kingdom on the earth. And if you want more, you can look at one of my professors, Shia Cohen, who has a great lecture on this. But anyway, so that's what I'd say there. And then remind me again, what was the other part of the question?
It was mostly about succession. And if we look, well, it seems like there's a need for succession. But if we look at something like Matthew 18, where we see the college of apostles, if you will, or apostolic college, that certainly continued in succession just through apostolic succession. The episcopate. But so if we have a succession there, it seems likely that there would be a succession for what's taking place in Matthew 16 as well, with the Petrine headship of the Apostolic College.
And I'd like to address kind of the Matthew 18:18 objection, because that's one that I've heard a lot. And I actually, the more I looked into this, the more amazed I was by how that objection can be reversed into an argument for the papacy. So basically, W.D. Davies and Dale Allison, in their international critical commentary in the New Testament, which is considered by many to be like the best modern commentary on Matthew, and I would put myself in that camp. It's a 3-volume set. It is absolutely incredible. Like they're charitable to like all traditions. They take seriously all kinds of objections. It shows you why Dale Allison is considered the world's expert on Matthew. But in that book, they talk about, in the 2nd volume, chapters 8 to 18 of Matthew's gospel, how the authority given in 1619 is wider than the authority given in 1818. Now, let me explain that. So in Matthew 16:19, you have to refer to verse 18 first, where it says, "Upon this rock I'll build my church," right? My church, Jesus is referring to the universal church. But then when we get to Matthew 18:18, Jesus is laying down a halakhic policy, halakhic being kind of normative law, right? Procedure, ethics in that way, on how to deal with, like, if a brother sins against you, how do you settle that? And then he says, whatever, take it to the church, right? Now, it could be a reference to the universal church there, but because Jesus is laying down a policy for like future churches, it's more likely that, and this is the consensus of scholars, that it's referring to individual churches,
the local church,
right? Individual synagogues, right? And so in Matthew 16:19, Peter is given binding and loosing authority over the universal church. In Matthew 18:18, the apostles, they have universal authority. I'm not going to deny that, right? But it's over each and every local church. And that's an important distinction, right? Because as we know, the apostles, they went to different churches and founded them. They told them the halakha of Jesus, the gospel, and how to, settle issues and do that sort of thing. But it's an authority for each and every church, right? Whereas it would make sense then that Peter could command in the beginning of the first 10 chapters of Acts, the universal church. He steps up from among the apostles and begins to make decisions and begins to say, hey, we need to pick a successor for Judas, right? So I would put my hat in saying that the authority given in Matthew 16:19 is over the universal church. The authority given in Matthew 18:18 to Peter and all the apostles is over each and every church. And there's a distinction there, right? There is a distinction.
Plus, the distinction also seems to be that Matthew 16:18 through 19, there's kind of a single emphasis, emphasis on a single individual. Whereas in Matthew 18, you have more of a collective unit. So I agree with you that obviously the apostles and therefore their successors, the episcopate, has a universal authority, but only collectively when they're under Peter. Whereas with Peter, he can function individually, and likewise, therefore, the successor of Peter can function individually.
And
as well.
I think this makes sense of why, like with apostolic succession, because the apostles had universal authority, right? We wouldn't deny that, obviously, because they were, the bearers of divine revelation, right? Which divine revelation by its very nature is universal, infallible, right? And hence that causes the apostolic authority to be universal and infallible. They are the chief guardians of the apostolic deposit of divine revelation. Matthew 18:18, I think, explains why the authority of the apostles when they founded local churches doesn't make every single, let's say, bishop a universal authority, like a universal pope, right? Like each of the apostles, they had universal authority, but that doesn't transfer over, let's say,
to the episcopate.
Into the episcopate, right? Into each and every
individual
bishop, right? Individual. And the reason why is because Matthew 18:18, the authority that the apostles have is for each and every local church. It's a local authority, right? Whereas now somebody might say, but Suan, you just said the apostles have universal authority. And you're saying that Peter has universal authority and the Pope has universal authority. So wait, everybody's a Pope? And it's like, wait, I mean, all the apostles are popes? Wait, no, hold on. So, Pope Leo has a great bit where he talks about how, yes, like each of the apostles are the guardians of the church, right? They have this universal authority. But among the apostles, if a leader, or let's say a leader that must be chosen among them, it would be Peter. So in the normative structure and order of things, right? Jesus empowered the apostles to deal with all the matters that they needed to in the church. But when it came time in the early Jerusalem church for there to be one, like to be very like one hands-on leader, it was in the natural order, if you will, that Peter would rise up from among the apostles. So he was the natural head, the natural pick to be leader, to be spokesman.
So would it be fair to say that the apostles, like considered individually, had a universal authority,
right?
But ultimately that they would have to defer that authority if push comes to shove to Peter,
right?
But if there's no major problem, no dispute, they could exercise that universal authority.
Yes, and this is so important to mention because I began looking into studies on like the nature of authority, and I think there's a major confusion on this topic, especially when we look into the New Testament, because, for example, I distinguish between objective versus subjective authority. And here's what I mean by that. Subjective authority is the kind of authority that you actually exert over somebody, like the influence that you have, right? So, for example, let's say that you see two politicians arguing with each other, right? And one politician rebukes the other, and the one rebuked, he says, you know what, you're right. I recant my position. I'm going to listen to you, right? Well, you would say that then the politician who rebuked the other and got the other to concede his position, the rebuking one has the authority. That's subjective authority, the actual influence you have. But let me add some context. The one who rebuked the other politician, the rebuking one, was a member, let's say, the House of Lords, right? Which is under the Prime Minister in the United Kingdom. Oh, well, okay. So in a sense, yeah, at that moment, that lower member in the cabinet exercised greater authority. But in terms of the structure, the normative order of things, the prime minister still has greater authority than that member of the House of Lords. And so my point with that example is when you look at the divine structure of the church, when you look at the normative order, the normal way of things, how things are supposed to operate based on what Jesus says, especially Luke 22, which is, I think, a profound example, or even other passages where, for example, when the disciples fall asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane, who does Jesus blame? Peter. So there's this expectation then that Peter is responsible for the others. And in that way, then that implicitly says that he has a kind of authority, a kind of care over them. Is not a kind of dictator, right? Because that's not how Jesus is going to operate. Because in Matthew's gospel, Jesus, his ethic is that you're not supposed to rule like the Gentile kings and rulers, right? You're not supposed to lord over the people. Sure. But he says basically that his model is one of care. It's one of servant. And so the whole point then is that if you're going to look into the New Testament for evidence of the papacy, for hierarchy, look at who Jesus puts in charge of caring for somebody else, right? That's where you're going to find the hierarchy. The hierarchy is not going to be expressed with pomp and circumstance and all that, and so on and so forth. You need to look at what is the normative structure, what's the normal order of things. And when you look at that normative structure, I think you see, like when in Matthew, sorry, I'm going on for a bit, but in Matthew chapter 16, when Jesus says, the words to Peter, you are Peter and on this rock I'll build my church. That is his definitive statement on the identity of Peter. And we know that because in the Greek, and John Noland, who's a really great New Testament scholar, even though he's skeptical of the Isaiah 22 allusion, he points out that, when Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, Jesus then mirrors that declaration by saying, and you are Peter, right? And so the point there is that this great declaration, this profound statement of identity, is now being given back to Peter. And so our ears need to perk up and pay attention, because this is the definitive statement. This is the normative statement on who Peter is. And that's where I base the argument for the papacy then.
This is fascinating. I like your distinction here between subjective and
objective authority. Oh, I should. Yeah. And so basically, sorry to interrupt, but subjective authority, that refers to like one's individual, let's say,
a moral
influence,
authority.
Right? Whereas objective authority refers to the structure, the actual constitutional order. Sure, something like that.
Yeah. It's fascinating because I would say that even carries over into the episcopate today, because instead of maybe using a bishop today, let me use Athanasius of Alexandria, a historical case. As the Patriarch of Alexandria, did he exercise universal primacy in the way that a successor of Saint Peter does? No. He wasn't the Pope, right? Or at least not the Pope of Rome. He was the Pope of Alexandria, but not the Pope of Rome.
Right.
So he didn't have the same kind of authority maybe as the Pope of Rome. However, we can certainly say there was a sense in which he was exercising a universal authority, maybe in the way that you're referring to here when you say subjectively.
Yeah, right.
Kind of a moral authority.
Oh, yes.
But push comes to shove, ultimately, the Pope is the one who has that more objective authority. And that then means that even today, there's a responsibility for even individual bishops, though they may have objective authority only in their diocese.
Right.
They may still have a subjective duty and authority to proclaim the truth to the universal church.
Yeah. And to use just another analogy to explain this distinction, I mean, suppose, Michael, you and I are brothers. I love to use this analogy.
Yeah.
Well, we are brothers, right? But let's say we have the same father.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
And let's say dad's leaving home for a bit, and we have all of our brothers with us, and you're the eldest, right? And let's say that dad says, Michael, I leave you in charge. You have the objective claim that nobody else can say that you don't have, right? It's a claim given from a higher authority to you. And so, for example, let's say that I, as the younger brother who's like very articulate, has a lot of charisma, I can get the other brothers I can really influence them, right? I have very strong subjective authority, very strong influence, but you have objective authority. You have the objective claim to like command, because you have it from a higher authority. And in our like context today, where we live in a democracy, right, where we elect our leaders and we have to be influenced by them, or sometimes people just say, I'm not going to follow that law, or whatever that politician, I don't know, who cares about. Well, in the biblical world, there was very much a concept of objective authority, where if that person has authority from God, maybe they don't have the strongest subjective sway on you, but you owe them submission because they have this objective authority from God. Like, for example, when David refuses to kill King Saul, right, because he is God's chosen king, he's acknowledging you have objective authority. Or even in the New Testament, when Jesus talks about the scribes and the Pharisees who are seated on the seat of Moses, he's acknowledging they have an objective authority. They have that claim from Moses in some way.
Even if they're lacking in the subjective department.
Right. Yeah. They don't have strong subjective authority. I mean, even the people, right, in the Gospels, they say, wow, you teach with authority, unlike the Pharisees. Well, what do they mean by authority there? Well, Jesus acknowledges the objective authority of the Pharisees and scribes, but the people that are talking about the subjective authority. And so even that distinction's in the Bible.
Sure. To kind of riff off the example you gave here, let's say I'm the brother who's been given the objective authority to take care of the household while the parents are away. You're the younger brother, but you kind of more charismatic. You might have more subjective authority and pull with them.
Yeah.
Let's say I'm in the house and you and the other brothers are out in the backyard and an accident is about to happen and you see it's about to happen. You're not going to go and call me in the house and say, hey, I need you to come and tell so-and-so to watch out. There's a snake that's about to bite him or something. You're going to tell him, hey, watch out for the snake, right? Likewise, I think that we can say that there is a duty for those who are in the episcopate to speak up and warn others about
Mhm.
things that are taking place even outside their own diocese, but in the way that they might have a subjective authority, while always recognizing the Pope has an objective authority.
I mean, that's a great example because that gets into the Acts 15 objection that James seems to be the one who settles the issue at the Apostolic Council, right?
Yeah.
Remember that this council was convened because there was a dispute on, whether or not the Jewish law needs to be kept even by Gentile Christians. And, Peter gives the speech of the council, right? And I say it's the speech, right? Because there are a lot of reasons. I wrote about this on Catholic Answers. My article is Center Stage at the big council or something like that. Center Stage at the council. And Peter gives this speech where he stands up from among the brethren. And whenever Acts talks about he stood among them or Peter stands up, right? That always conveys that he's about to give like a ruling. He's about to do something significant.
Sure.
So he stands up from among them and he says, brothers, you know that in the early days, it was chosen from among you by God that it would be my mouth that would open the church to the Gentiles, right? Okay, so Peter's saying, this is my ministry. This was the ministry that was given to me to open the church to the Gentiles, right? Yep. And then he mentions Cornelius again. And that's just like, that just settles the debate right there. And then he refers to James refers to Amos to confirm Peter's words. Yes. But anyway, at the end of Peter's speech, he says, and we believe that we are saved by faith through grace or something like that. And that, final saying there, that's him speaking on a universal level, right? It goes silent. Paul and Barnabas speak, but Paul and Barnabas' speech is not recorded.
Yeah.
Because that shows you that Luke, when he's writing Acts, he's choosing, intentionally who really gave the most important speeches, right? Because you have to make that decision if you're writing on papyrus and you have limited characters, right? Yeah. James goes up, he gives his speech. He relates what Simon, his brother, has said. Yeah. And then he says, and I make the decision, right? And then he lays down the decision and people say, oh, well, James just made the decision. Well, there are multiple reasons why James, it would make sense, would have the final word. One is that in Acts 12:17, after Peter's arrested, but then he's freed, he has to go into hiding, and probably he did missionary work. So I think it was Agis Fernando and Oscar Kuhlman who both argued that Peter, had to move on from Jerusalem into the other churches, right? Because also Jerusalem was no longer the universal church. It was the mother church, though. So it had a kind of primacy, because it was the heart of the Jewish world very much. And James, Peter mentions by name. So kind of almost like picking who would be the next person who'd be the head of the Jerusalem church, right? And James had immense subjective authority. He had immense subjective authority. And also because it's his diocese, it would make sense that he would also get to have the final word, right? Because Peter's authority, even Pastor Eternus talks about this, right? Like the authority of the Pope is not to kind of like when the Pope, exercises his universal authority, it's not incompatible with the immediate and ordinary authority of bishops in their own diocese, right? And so, I think the objection expects something totally unreasonable, that Peter would just settle the issue and, James, boohoo, Peter just took over your diocese and, shut up, James. No. James is a brother. Right, the ecclesiology of the episcopate, right? They're still brothers, and so James also has to put in his voice. And James also had immense subjective authority among the Jewish Christians, and so it would be important for them to see that. Oh, okay, and James is with him too. But that doesn't take away from the objective authority that Peter has. Yeah. But James doesn't have that objective claim, but Peter does, and that's how I would distinguish then the authority of James. James had the subjective authority, the influence, but who had the objective claim? Peter.
What concerns me, however, is today some people are listening to the subjective authority of other bishops over and against the objective authority of the Pope. That's what concerns me today, is they're listening to some of those charismatic Episcopal figures, not naming names, but some of those bishops that, it's clear some people are following those bishops even over the Pope.
Right.
That's where I start to become a little bit concerned when it comes to some of these bishops exercising an inappropriate subjective authority, while I still recognize the concept objectively at the end of the day.
Right.
Let me mention something here about James having the final word. I want to get your thoughts on it. Even though I think that everything you just said is true and I agree with, let's just say that it was actually James, hypothetically speaking, who settled the issue and not Peter.
Okay.
Let's just hypothetically go with it.
If I can ask,
Yeah,
so is it, are we assuming that, let's say, Peter never gave a speech?
Let's just say
James.
he never gave a speech, or whatever speech he gave was somehow non-authoritative. Let's just go with it, right?
Okay.
Let's just try to steelman the Protestant objection here. I don't think that would really take away from the concept of papal primacy.
Sure.
Or the papacy having the final say at the end of the day, because you can have bishops assembled in a council issuing a definitive judgment without the Pope issuing the definitive judgment himself.
Yeah.
So in other words, you could have a scenario where the Pope does not authoritatively rule on something. The council comes together, they authoritatively rule on it, and the Pope will come back later and just confirm it.
Right.
But they're effectively the ones saying, here's what it's going to be.
Exactly.
And again, yes, he confirms it.
Yeah.
So we could even see the book of Acts, the Council of Acts 15 in that way, if we weren't to accept everything that you just said. So in other words, if somebody were to push back on it and object to it, well, we would still say, but this doesn't really touch on the issue of papal primacy.
Right. Because once Christ gives the objective claim on the identity of Peter, you would need something like that again in order to see if it was transferred, if it was gone. But so long as that claim remains and it's undefeated or unchanged, that remains. So I even still, let's say Peter didn't give a speech, I would still use the objective subjective distinction. And I think it would also be really crucial that in the first 10 chapters of Acts, you do see Peter exercising really like strong, let's say almost like not micromanaging, but like very much you see that he's the leader of the church in the first 10 chapters. And I'm not saying this, it's J.N.D. Kelly in his book, A Dictionary of Popes, Anglican scholar, who points out this fact. And other people will point out too, like, yeah, Peter is really calling the shots in the early church. Yeah, so I would say that in response to that particular objection. I'll also say that I think there is a scenario in history where this similar situation happened, right? And it would be Leo and Chalcedon, right? Because Leo basically in his tome, Leo thinks, like, I've already settled the issue, right? Why, but I'll let you have this council, right? Just to confirm and get the moral
fuller judgment,
right?
Is what he says.
And so it's like, the Pope settled the issue. Peter settled the issue. The people went silent afterwards, except for Paul and Barnabas, who spoke up in favor of obviously Peter's position. But the people who were once quarreling, they were silent after Peter's speech. That conveys that something was done. And then the icing on the cake, right? The cherry on top was James.
That's the way I read Acts as well. And I'm glad you pointed that out with Leo, because a lot of people are like, okay, well, does this mean somehow the tome of Leo wasn't definitive prior to? No, it actually was definitive. Leo thought it was definitive. Well, why then did he acquiesce to a council? Because he says, so that a fuller judgment can be offered.
Right.
Well, and some people might say, well, how can you have a fuller judgment to something that's already definitive in nature?
Right. Yeah.
Well, it's simple. You want to get people on board to express their affirmation of that definitive judgment. Even today, if the Pope were to teach something ex cathedra, I sure would want to know that my bishop has received that.
Yes.
I sure would want to hear his judgment on it as well.
Yeah.
And if he doesn't agree with it, I want to hear that he doesn't agree with it, so I can know my bishop is in dissent from the magisterium.
Right. And even if a prophet, like in the Old Testament, with divine authority, gives a teaching from God, gives a command from God, and the people of Israel don't obey it, right? Or the king doesn't obey it, whatever. The fact that they don't obey it doesn't mean that it lacks authority. No, because it has divine backing. Just as when the Pope declares something ex cathedra, it is from the Holy Spirit protecting him that he's able to do that. It doesn't take away from his authority if other people don't listen. Right, because that's making a category mistake between objective and subjective authority, and this is why I think this distinction is so fundamental. Right, I think if you acknowledge this distinction, the pieces start coming together.
Very helpful. You mentioned earlier And I want to talk a little bit about Harvard, but let's first talk about the Dominicans because you mentioned them.
Yeah.
So I remember you released a video a while back, and it was an incredible video. Forget the title. I'll have to look.
It was like how I discerned out of religious life or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was the last video that you did before you
the final episode of Intellectual Conservatism.
It was incredible, and I watched that and I thought, wow, man, I hope he. When he, yeah, she watched it as well. I was like, man, I hope he continues to do apologetics. But anyways, you went to the Dominicans for a little bit, but you ended up discerning out. Can you maybe talk to us about that experience?
Man, yeah. I mean, that video that I did on my channel where I go through, like, I think it was almost 2 hours where I just talk about the whole experience, everything that I had to do. It was a difficult decision. All right. So I spent the first 2 years as a Catholic, from the moment that I was received into the church to leading up to July of that I entered this past July. I had discerned for 2 years that I was going to be a Dominican, and I saw myself as a priest. And man, I really loved the church. And so I saw the beauty of spiritual fatherhood. I saw the beauty of celibacy. I saw the beauty of poverty, right? The evangelical counsels, right? The religious vows. And I thought that was my calling. And then I entered into the order finally. And in 4 months, I realized this is not for me. This is not my calling.
Why?
The first thing that I noticed was that I never had lasting peace. I would have moments of consolation, moments of peace, but like when I would really sit down and think, or when I just have these quiet moments of prayer, my heart, something didn't feel right. And so I would do this meditation before the Blessed Sacrament, where basically I would grab a journal and I'd write out all my thoughts. And eventually what I do is I would empty my mind of all of its thoughts. And then I would see, okay, Lord, let me pose a question to you now, because my mind is tired. I have nothing in my, I'm not doing anything right. I'm not talking myself into anything. My mind is quiet. Tell me, is this my calling? And I noticed that my heart would rise up and say, I'm not here anymore. My heart was saying, I'm gone. I moved on. But then my mind would come in and say, oh, no, Suan, you said you're going to do this. You look really good in the habit. You want to be a priest. You're a fraud if you leave the order, whatever. People are going to say things. And I saw that my heart, in telling me that it wasn't my call, I had peace. My mind telling me that I had to be something was giving me anxiety and not consolation. All right, so there was that. And then eventually I learned too more about my personality, because with the Dominicans, we still kept on doing like personality workshops and learning about our identity. They were very big on human formation, right? Forming me as a man to be more wholesome, to be more introspective and all that. And I learned basically that I have a very independent entrepreneurial personality. And it's like, duh, right? Like I realized that because like I started this YouTube channel, I do this research, I have a personal initiative to do like, the research on Eliakim and all that, to talk to you and get on your channel, right? So there was this entrepreneurial drive in me, and I realized that I really do like to have that freedom and that space to make those calls, right? And that's not a bad thing. That's not something to be ashamed of, right? That can be a very holy thing if directed towards the kingdom of God. And so, this is the last thing. One of my brothers, we talk to each other, Brother Benedict, God bless his heart. He's such a great man. I don't know if he's ever going to watch this, but Brother Benedict, I love you. And Brother Benedict, we sat down, we talked to each other, and he said, Suan, I think you're struggling with the vow of obedience, the religious vow of obedience, the religious observance of obedience. Because for me as a Catholic, right, I'm going to obey the church. I'm going to be faithful till the day I die and even into the eternity, right? Because that the church is the body of Christ. I'm not going to leave her, never. And he said, so it's not obedience in that way. I'm not struggling with obeying the church and the teachings of the church, right? If the magisterium were to say that I was wrong, I would be happy and say, thank you, Lord. Thank you, church, for showing me the way, right? The Lord through the church. And so, I realized that, he used this example of, let's say, Suan, that the Dominican said, we don't need you to get a PhD in New Testament studies. we don't need any more PhDs in theology. Suan, we need you to go down to Puerto Rico, learn Spanish, and spend the rest of your life as a priest in this one parish. I would have to accept that out of the religious vow of obedience. And I realized that just doesn't speak to me, right? Like, I really have this strong sense that I am called to like academic study, to apologetics work, right? And somebody might say, well, but Suan, like they're the Dominicans, right? They're not going to make you, I mean, they're not going to see this talent in you and not do it. That's not the point. The point is, in principle, I was struggling with obedience. And so, obedience is not, I'll obey as long as I get what I want, if I have a reasonable expectation that it's going to go my way. No, obedience is obedience. And so I realized that, I'm not cut out for religious life.
But I could totally see you continuing to do apologetics. As I've said to you before, I'll say it here, even live. I think you're the future of apologetics in Catholicism.
Oh,
yeah. Turn your mic on too, so everybody else can hear you, because I don't think. Is your mic turned up all the way? Look at the fader. Go to channel number 1, the microphone, and turn it up. Like, turn the fader up. But yeah. she'll get the hang of it here.
Sure, yeah.
But yeah, honestly, I really do see that in you. That's why I said even before, with that last video you did, before you went into the Dominicans, I was like, man, I really hope he comes back and does apologetics. We need more of this.
I will say just a few things really quick, and maybe this will be all I say. But another thing I realized too was that I hadn't discerned marriage as seriously as I should have. I kind of took it for granted because, it's the natural vocation, right? And so I was just saying, of course, like I know like what marriage is about as a single guy. No. I needed to discern it more seriously. And then also I realized too that as I've developed and gone over time, I realized too, like the idea of being a father and having children, that really does appeal to me a lot, which is good. I mean, even when I was discerning the religious life, that appealed to me, but even more so in a direct way. I'm like, I would like to have kids. I would like to have a wife, all that wife. So there's that. So I'm not advertising though or anything like that.
But I mean, it's something that you shouldn't deny about yourself. So I think that's good. And it certainly is rewarding. So, well, let me ask you about also Harvard, because you were recently accepted in Harvard. Tell us a little bit about that.
All right. So I leave the Dominicans, right? And I go back into civilian life. And I know that the next step for me is graduate school, because I love university environments, like a bunch of young people and professors on the cusp of, intellectual breakthroughs and just the life and energy of it. Right. So I realized that I really wanted to be back in an academic environment. And I started looking around at different institutions, and I had lots of great institutions to choose from, and scholarships and all that. Now, I applied to Harvard Divinity School because there were actually scholars there who I wanted to study under, right? So to name 2 of them, Annette Yoshiko Reed, she's like an expert in Second Temple Judaism. She wrote a book called Jewish Christianity and the History of Judaism. And that book she talks about like the idea of apostolic succession and rabbinic succession. I'm like, that's exactly what I love to research. And she was writing about it. And it's just interesting to see like her thoughts on it. And then there's another scholar named Shia Cohen, who I mentioned before at Harvard. And he's considered the world's leading expert on like rabbinic Judaism, the Mishnah, and I don't know so much about the Old Testament, but like ancient Judaism, he is the recognized expert in the field. And he wrote a paper called A Virgin Defiled, where he talked about the similar concepts of heresy among the early rabbis and the early church fathers. And I was like, so I love to see like this intermingling of the relationship between ancient Judaism and early Christianity. And so I was like, you know what, let me apply there. And also, at Harvard Divinity School, you have access to the whole Harvard campus. And so, for example, I'm hoping to take a course in Harvard Law School on Jewish law, Halakha,
Wow.
So think about it. I can study Jewish law, halakha at Harvard Law School.
Sure.
Who would pass up that opportunity,
right.
you know? And so basically I just decided, you know, I want to go to Harvard Divinity School because, you know, there's this a really great emphasis on looking at Christianity from an ancient Jewish perspective. And so I wanted to do that.
We need more of that.
Right. So basically imagine like Brant Petrie, but at Harvard.
That's the man. Shout out to Brant.
I love Brant. And then one last thing. So when I was flying into the open house before I made my decision, you know, because they had an open house at the Divinity School, I was seated. I saw this girl on the plane and she had like a Harvard shirt. And so I was like, you know what? Let me sit next to her and see like if we're going to the same place. I sit down next to her and she's like, yeah, I'm going to the Divinity School open house. And I'm like, yeah, it's crazy. You know, we get to talking. She's a Jewish Catholic.
Wow.
And we talk about halakha, we talk about Hebrew, we talk about my story, her story of Judaism and Catholicism. And I'm just like, God, is this a sign? You know, I'm meeting a Jewish Catholic on my, and so, you know, I'm doing this because I love the Jewish community. I love the Catholic community, especially the Hebrew Catholic community.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Like I love to study the Lord in his original historical context. And so I think Harvard would be the best place for me to do that.
That's awesome. I'm excited about that. Is there a way that people can help you with that, by the way? I imagine you probably need a little bit of help with that.
Yeah. So Harvard is paying for most of my education, which is really great. But like the main thing that's going to cost a lot is the living expenses themselves. Sure. So just like, you know, food, dining, that sort of, you know, and housing and all that. And so, you know, I have people who are helping me, my patrons, they're doing some good work. But really, like, if you want to support, you know, helping me survive at Harvard and all that, you could become a patron, maybe do a one-time donation. You can email me at icatholicism@gmail.com and we can, you know, arrange that and we'll figure that out. I might have a donation drive later because I do have someone who would be willing to match, you know, some donations. And so we'll see. But yeah, just seriously, like if people want to support, I'm not saying you have to, but you know, if you want to support me and help me as I study the ancient Jewish roots of Catholicism at Harvard, then, you know, that's an opportunity.
We're going to put links to that in the show notes after this. So y'all look for that, where they can become a patron and support you. And
I want to mention too, very briefly that Harvard does have a thriving Catholic community. That's a little known secret. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that, but they do have a thriving community there. Impressive young people. I'm going to interview one of my classmates in the future, and he's doing work for the Holy Father, you know, and he's a very devout Catholic. I mean, he studies Second Temple Judaism, Cyprian of Carthage, Maximus the Confessor. And I mean, these are serious Catholics who are at Harvard. And there's an Opus Dei priest, Father Jeff Langan. I don't know if he's watching, but Father Jeff, you're awesome. And I mean, he's great. And so I'm very confident that, you know, people might be worried like, Suan, are you going to lose your Catholic faith at Harvard? No, they have a solid community there. And I'll be staying in a house with other fellow Catholic graduate students. So I'm very much going to maintain my faith.
We need you to.
Again,
we need more of what you're offering. Let's I want to get everybody to send some chat questions. We'll take just a few of those here in just a moment. So put them in the chat. Make sure to put them to @Reason and Theology. Let me ask you one final question here before we take a few chat questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Give me maybe one major reason to become a Catholic. Anything that come to mind? Like, what's the biggest thing if people hear nothing else?
Yeah. I know it's a quick question, but the answer might be a bit elongated.
Okay.
So bear with me.
It's fine.
When Jesus is praying in the Gospel of John in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? You know, he prays, Lord, let them be one, just as you and I are one. John 17, that prayer of God incarnate before he dies on the cross, what brought him consolation, what brought him comfort, was the idea that his family would be one. If you think about it, in the Gospels, the Synoptics, Jesus' own family, except his Blessed Mother, but Jesus' own family, his brothers and sisters, Joseph was probably dead by the time Jesus started his ministry. Jesus' brothers and sisters had abandoned him. His family, as he says is anyone who does the will of God.
Yeah.
I think Jesus very much longed for a family once he had left his own home to go begin his ministry. And who was the family? It was the church. It was the disciples. It was the men and women who followed him. So for Christ, the idea that his family would be one brought him comfort before he died. Think about that. What comforted God before he died on the cross? The unity of his family. In Catholicism, God did everything possible short of taking away human freedom. Yeah. Right. So God didn't take away human freedom. That would be an easy way to secure unity, to secure obedience. If he just took away free will and then we all just became robots, right? Then we'd all conform and do the same thing. No. Jesus, God, he kept our free will, but he did everything possible within human nature to secure that unity. So what did he do? He instituted a magisterium. With the binding, loosing power of the apostles, of Peter, that was a power that the Pharisees had to declare halakha on faith and morals, basically, to declare what is the normative way. What are we going to do with our belief, how we act as Christians, right? That binding, loosing power, that was there. Jesus, knowing our human nature, he built that magisterium. He built traditions that the apostles could hand down orally, because also we need traditions to help us interpret texts, just as for the Constitution, right? You know, Supreme Court justices, they'll look at the traditions outside of the Constitution, like the Federalist Papers, etc., to help them interpret the text, right? My argument basically here is that on Catholicism, you can say that God did everything possible short of taking away human freedom to secure unity. I don't think you can say that about Protestantism, for example. Because, I mean, people would say it would be nice if we had an infallible magisterium. Yeah, it would be nice, right? Right? And God is a prudent God. God is a wise God. God knows human nature. And so why wouldn't he give a magisterium? In the Old Testament, when he gave the law to Moses, what did Moses then do? He built a judicial system to interpret the law, right? What did God do when he gave divine revelation? He also had a living authority in the prophets, sure, and the high priest with the Urim and the Thummim. Yep. To give the divine rulings, right? God has always shown this wisdom with human nature to give us the living authority and the written word and the traditions as well. So I would say that the strongest reason to be Catholic is that God did everything short of taking away human freedom, everything in accordance with human nature to secure unity. Now, obviously, people are going to say, well, you know, the Pope is a divisive figure. The papacy hasn't perfectly secured unity. Sure. Because there's that reality of human disobedience. There's also the reality of human differences, right? But did God, knowing that, at least try? Did God, knowing that, at least institute that objective authority? And as a Catholic, I can say yes, right? That he did have that one final, you know, where the buck stops, that principle of unity, the Pope. And so I see the Pope as like that elder brother that I used in my earlier example, where he's the one who can say when there's a dispute among the brothers, Father left me in charge, so here's the ruling. So I think that's the strongest reason to be Catholic, because I think that when we remain in the unity of the church under the elder brother Peter, that brings consolation to Christ in the garden. And I always go back to Christ praying in the garden before his death. And I ask myself, you know, some people will say, "Oh yeah, I believe in unity," and they'll just say it like, I mean, not to be mean, but it almost sounds like lip service, right? Because it's like, what are you actually doing though to unify the church? Well, you don't have that power. We need that authority from God to unify the church, right? That's the only authority that we would all universally accept. And so then, why wouldn't God have installed a universal authority if his heart was aching for the unity of his church in the garden?
Sure. Yeah. It certainly makes sense. And I didn't know that would be your answer. But that's exactly what I think as well. Ultimately, the magisterium is a deal breaker for me when it comes to discerning between Catholicism, Protestantism, and Orthodoxy. Only in Catholicism do you have that magisterium that looks very, very different than what we see elsewhere. And it is that deal breaker, in my opinion. So yeah, I'm right there with you. Here's a question from Saint Charbel. Is Suan aware of Hebrew Catholic view Simon / Kephas equals Shimon Hatzadik who held absolute power over the Jewish people. Creation of Cephas office is a condition of Jesus being Messiah. Not sure I'm necessarily following that, but I'm throwing it out there in case you are.
So, yeah, I mean, just to be upfront, I don't think I'm totally aware of the reference that's going on here, right? But I know that in Maccabees, there is a reference to like a Simon who was a high priest and did have like immense authority. And Ephraim makes the allusion from the Simon Peter of the New Testament to Simon of Maccabees, and saying that both were like high priests who had universal authority. Ephraim does make that connection. So maybe that's what he's referring to, but that's all I'll say.
Thank you for the super chat, Sean Matthew. He asks, given your extensive biblical study on the papacy, do you think it's possible for the Pope to non-definitively teach something harmful to souls, like heresy?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, right? Because, you've talked about this, which is the infallible security, if I'm not mistaken, of the papal teachings, that basically, even if the church...
charism of safety, yeah.
Right. Even if the church is, let's say, revises its opinion or its teaching on a certain issue, right, in light of, I don't know, new developments in theology, whatever, the thing that was there before wouldn't be objectively harmful to the soul. So, for example, it wouldn't be like, promulgating the mass, right, as an example, like liturgy that's actually harmful to the soul. The church is not going to do that, right? There's that safety there.
Sure.
Because if you don't have that safety, then you would destroy so much of the validity and credibility of the church in the first place, because then you could always ask, yeah, but is this going to harm my soul? And that's like, if you don't have that minimum safety, then, that really does destroy at a fundamental level the trustworthiness of the church. But going to the biblical question, right? From what I can tell, Peter never taught anything that was harmful to souls, right? Now, Peter's moral character, when it faltered, did cause scandal. Right, it was problematic, and so Galatians 2 is a great example of this. But I would attribute that to Peter's moral example failing, right? Because Peter, on one hand, he's got the zeal to lead the church, to be faithful, to be that leader. Other times, he chickens out when he has to be diplomatic, and he tries to appease the Jewish Christians when they come down from Jerusalem, the emissaries of James, right, to get him to change his public stance on things. But I don't think that Peter taught anything. Now, actions can teach, sure, but that's not what we're talking about when we refer to the magisterium today, in terms of its moral character. When we refer to teaching, we really mean like teaching in that way. So, I mean, because from what I can tell too, I don't think the apostles even ever taught anything that was harmful, to the church. So I would say that there was that minimum security that was there. And I'll say that.
Yeah. I think of something that I heard Eric Ibarra say years ago on this question. And he asked the question to somebody who was denying this and saying the Pope could teach heresy. And he asked the question, well, if that's the case, if the Pope could teach heresy in his non-definitive capacity, does that then mean that the magisterium could teach for 2,000 years heresy, as long as it wasn't definitive, as long as it wasn't ex cathedra or a solemn definition from an ecumenical council? You could have the magisterium for 2,000 years non-definitively teaching heresy. So a pope and encyclicals, apostolic exhortations, whatever capacity, as long as it's non-definitive, the Pope could every single day teach heresy. Ecumenical councils non-definitively, every single council could teach non-definitively a heresy, and somehow this doesn't invalidate the Catholic claims of the magisterium. And oddly enough, some people would say, yeah, that's true. Yes, the Pope could teach heresy for 2,000 years as long as it's not ex cathedra. But it's like, once you've embraced that, you've pretty much shown that the magisterium is practically useless. I mean,
when it's
unless it's some rare definitive teaching, your magisterium is practically useless. Like, why do you even, at this point, why should we even take this thing seriously? And I think that that's a good argument against those who would say, yeah, sure, the Pope can teach heresy, this and that, a council.
Well, like what you were saying there, from infallibility to indefectibility, where the church is not going to persist, for so long in error, right? Indefectibility there. And then from indefectibility, you can probably get to safety. Although, this is something I need to think more about, how to get to all those steps.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear more of your research on that when you get a chance to look into it. Here's another one for you from Figu New 123, wrapping it up here. Regarding the papacy, what are Suan's thoughts on the charism of true and never failing faith from Vatican I, which is based on Luke 22:32, if he is aware of that?
Yeah. So, at least in my interpretation of Vatican I, maybe I'm mistaken here, maybe you can correct me, Michael, but the charism of true and unfailing faith, I would just connect that to infallibility, unless that's a distinct thing. But if I'm not mistaken, they are connected, right? Because the idea was that if Peter's faith doesn't fail and that he can therefore strengthen his brothers, that minimum credibility is retained, right? And so there is a protection at minimum, right, that his faith won't fail, whatever that, what that means, right? I mean, obviously it doesn't mean that the Pope is not going to chicken out, because that's what did happen with Peter.
Sure.
So in that way, you might say that Christ's prayer wasn't fulfilled, but in another way, it was fulfilled, because he does return. His faith doesn't fail ultimately, and he does return to strengthen his brothers, right? And so that's where I would kind of interpret the Vatican I there, referring to infallibility, and at least maybe you could get safety from that, right? Maybe.
I argue that one can. But yeah, this has been epic. I think that's all of the chat questions, so we'll leave it there. We're certainly going to have a very long show tomorrow, so we'll be back with more tomorrow, because we're going to Suan is going to give a very thorough presentation responding to Gavin Ortland's arguments against icon veneration. So y'all look for that. And also patrons on Patreon and those who support here on YouTube with channel membership, we're going to have a patron and channel member exclusive either later on today or at some point tomorrow. We'll see as far as time, but y'all look for that soon. And Suan, any parting words, concluding thoughts? Put in a plug for anything you want to make people aware of?
Yeah, sure. So I have a YouTube channel and podcast called Intellectual Catholicism. You can find me on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. And if you'd like to be a patron, that's always appreciated. If you'd like to give a one-time donation, just email me at icatholicism@gmail.com. We can work that out. If you have questions, you can send them to me at icatholicism@gmail.com.
It's an awesome name.
But Michael, I'm very thankful to have
It's an honor to have you.
Right. For you to host me, for you to, take me from Kansas to Louisiana, all that. I mean, Michael, you're my brother.
Thank you.
And I love and appreciate all that you do.
Oh, it's an honor.
And, for everybody who's watching, God bless you. God love you. And I love you.
Everybody, thank y'all so much. Stay tuned for more tomorrow. That's going to do it. We'll see you later. God bless.